Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast, with your host, Chris Jennings.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining us once again today is a return guest, Tom Dokken. Tom, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Hey, nice to be back, Chris. Thanks for the invite.
And we're bringing Tom back on behalf of SportDOG Brand. And, we're going to get into the weeds of e-collars and some of the awesome tools that SportDOG Brand has. And Tom and I kind of talked offline before this to decide how to approach this conversation. And I thought it would really be best to start out with this as, the overall lifespan of a retriever, starting at the very beginning, some of the first things that a trainer would be doing, to introduce a collar. So Tom, let's go ahead and start there. Introducing the collar to a young dog. What age are you looking at here, and how do you start that process?
Yeah, and I think what we really need to start with would be what we're going to do preparation-wise before we would even start introducing the collar in a training scenario. So I'll go through that a little bit first. Mm-hmm. What we're going to want to do, let me give you my time frame on when I would start. Now, every trainer might be different on this, but I'm going to start right around that 8 month of age bracket when I'm going to introduce the remote collar. The reason I'm going to start at that age is I want to make sure that young dog has a really, really solid foundation with the leash on all of its basic commands. Mm-hmm. Let's just go through like coming, sitting, staying, laying down, the place command, which means to get on something, and the kennel command, which means to get into something. So to frame this, a remote collar is a reinforcement tool. It reinforces what your dog has already been taught. So we're not going to start off by teaching a dog with the remote collar. We're going to reinforce commands. So that means you have to have done your homework and have them really sharp on those commands. Now, somebody could say, well, hey, he's 10 weeks old. He's coming, he's sitting, he's staying, he's laying down. I got all these things. I'm going to start the collar. No, that's really not how it works. You need a lot of repetition on these commands to the point where everything is automatic. Now, what I am going to do by the time they get, let's say around that 4 month age stage, I'm going to have them start wearing the remote collar. And I'm not going to be using it, but they're going to wear it. So I'm going to put it on them before we go out and start doing any training. But here's the key for anybody, at home is when you put the collar on, I want you to do something fun with the dog right after you put it on. Now, every dog's different. So what's fun for one dog is going to be different for another one. And the reason we do this is I want them to think that the collar gives them freedom. And some people would go, I don't know about that. I want my dog to know that when I put that collar on, he needs to start, listening to me. Well, here's what happens. If you start putting the collar on your dog and then start making corrections, your dog is going to get collar wise. And collar wise means when the collar's on me, I'm going to listen to you. When you take the collar off, I'm not going to listen.
I've been around dogs like that.
Yep.
And I think it is a good, you make a really, really good point to do something really fun as soon as you put the collar on to get the dog excited. Because I've also been around a lot of dogs that, the handler will just get the collar out of the bag and you can see that dog's just fired up and ready to, and they know that they're going to be doing something fun. And that's a very good point that I hope our listeners picked up on. But yeah, the collar conditioning type thing, that's something I've experienced as well. How do you go about avoiding that?
Well, the whole idea there is to finish that off is I don't want them to ever know that the reason they listen is because the collar is on them. Because by doing this, in this particular manner, they're going to listen when the collar is off of them as well. So my dogs will never know that the reason they listen is because the collar is on. And that's really important because, you get them to the point where they're collar wise, it's really hard to get them over that. And then when that collar is off of them, they're going to just give you a whole different attitude. So super, super important to do that. Get them used to that. Then what we're going to do is we're not going to try to introduce all of the commands at once. And here's an important fact. We always start at the lowest setting on the remote collar. SportDOG Brand, you can set their collars down, which is just fantastic. You can go to a level 1. Now there's 7 levels on the dial, so 1 through 7, but you can set the collar unit down to a 1 level, a 2 level, or a 3 level. And the lighter it is, and in fact, probably the first on a number 1 level, you may not even feel anything if you put the contact points on your hand. You may not feel anything, for the first 3 levels on the dial at all. And the whole idea is that you just start off as light as you can. Now we're going to use the leash because our dog is very familiar with doing all the commands with the leash. And you're going to, one of probably the ones that you could start with, and everybody might be different on this too, is most dogs on a heeling standpoint, they're always going to be pulling, or a lot of them just pull on that cord. They're just going to keep pulling on the leash. So I will use the remote collar in conjunction with the leash. So let's just say your dog is, going for a walk and your dog is going to, be pulling. What I'm going to do is I'll have my finger on the button of the remote collar. And then when I give a little pull on the leash, I'll hit the button as well. So what we're looking for, and that's just one command, but what we're looking for is your dog's acknowledgement that it actually feels a little something with the remote collar. So you start at the lightest level, and what you might see initially is if the dog is feeling some contact, you might see their ear twitch. You might see them blink, or you might see them something like they'll scratch their neck, kind of like, hey, I feel something there. So you're at least looking for something where the dog acknowledges it feels the collar. And then I'll start off with maybe that one command, heeling. And gradually you're going to see once you start going up the line, your dog's not responsive. And all of a sudden, when you give a little tug on the leash, you're going to see the dog, start to, okay, I'm not going to be pulling. I'm going to pull a little less. Now, you're going to have a variety of commands you're going to work on, but work on one first before you go anywhere else. Now, I'm going to also say, I don't want you using that remote collar while your dog is doing any retrieving at this point. I don't want them to have to be concerned with any kind of command that you're giving while they're retrieving, because there is that break-in period where they have to learn these commands. So what that command is going to do, that's going to be a restraint command, because you're wanting the dog to heel back with you and not pull forward. Now, we've also taught a place command, which means to get onto something, which means the dog needs to leave you and go somewhere. And we've done this with the leash. And I also want to point out to people, they can go to the SportDOG website and visually see all of the things that I'm talking about, because it's always good to see it in action. So if you have a restraint command, I also want to have a command where I'm using the leash. I'm actually pulling the leash forward to get them to go onto something or into something. So we have a balance of restraint and then go to. So every command will be different, but I want to make sure that the dog responds a little bit to the remote collar. If your dog vocalizes or shows too much reaction, you're jumping up the line way too far. Your dog will tell you by the way they respond what level is right for them. And the heeling command is probably the best if you have a dog that pulls. So he's not pulling as much, pulling a little less. Now he's in a good position. And by going up a level, if your dog's not responding, up a level, you'll watch your dog respond to it and let them tell you what level they're at.
And you're starting this process, you mentioned kind of at 8 months, correct? Maybe a little later, or is that's pretty solid right there at 8 months?
Well, keep in mind that we're talking about, you and I right now, we're talking about a working dog, a dog that you want drive. They have to have drive to work. You know what I mean? So you could take drive away from a dog fast, no matter what you do, no matter what training you do, by just doing overcorrecting for them wanting them to be active. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. We always want a balance of keeping the dog's drive level, but then, gradually starting to ask for more control out of them. It's very seldom we would see somebody who brought us a young dog where you go, wow, you've had this dog way too far under control. That's normally not the situation.
Yeah.
So for us, if we're asking for, these dogs to be under control, starting to use the remote collar, we're also balancing that by taking breaks during the sessions and doing fun things. So we're always watching to make sure that we keep the dogs motivated. as we're starting to ask for control.
And now, is there a potential, I guess, a model that you would recommend for people to start with, or do you recommend, like, let's say, example, like the wetland hunter? Like, should someone start with the wetland hunter if they're planning on hunting with, the wetland hunter, or is there a gradual process to this?
I actually use the 425X because it has all of the features that I'm talking about, and all the models do. That would be the entry level collar. Now, SportDOG's got a lot of great products out there. A lot of the differences will be in the amount of range that you might have. For these retrievers, 500 yards of range. I mean, if your retriever is out 500 yards, you probably fell asleep somewhere. Now, if you had a pointer, maybe 500 yards is, you need more than that. So just the big thing is get the model that's going to work for you. The nice part about them, they're all waterproof, rechargeable. They just have all of the variable intensity. And I got to tell people that the variable intensity on the dial, years ago, that changed dog training forever, because I started training without any of those features. And the remote collar was not, let's say 30, 35 years ago, was not for the majority of the dogs. It was just too much. Now, those levels, those lighter levels, working your way up, I'm going to tell people they're less than if you're pulling on your leash. Wow. So I always tell people that this is your invisible leash. That's what you're going to be working with when you're all done and finished. You have an invisible leash. And the beauty is your dog doesn't know that, okay, I can get 30 yards away from you and I don't have to listen because you can't chase me and catch me to discipline me. And, 50 years ago when I started, I think most dog trainers weighed about 35 pounds because you were chasing dogs trying to catch them to get them under control. Now these dogs understand, because of this equipment, that, if I'm, 30 feet or 300 yards, when I hear that command, that person has control of me. And the beauty of this, when we're all done with all of this, they get in the habit of listening so well that very seldom are you going to give them a correction. And that's what's really fun to see, is that, they understand, okay, I'm under control. You're going to tell me to give the command once, and then they have the option of responding or not responding. And that's just a great part about the collar.
Yeah, that's a great tool. One thing I was curious about while you were kind of talking about that is, can you kind of describe, so like an entry level technique that you would use, other than you mentioned like with the lead and maybe the place? Is there another entry level technique that you would use with every dog that you train, that some of our listeners may be able to implement into their early training? Is there just one little technique that you may be able to share?
Well, I mean, really, the description that I gave you is where I would basically start. I'm going to start with a control command and then a command to move. So you could start that same process and it always has to happen with the leash. You're starting it and you're going leash with the remote collar. So when you'd put pressure on the leash for the command, you give the collar correction at the same time. And then gradually what you do is you give the command. As the dog gets better with this, you use collar correction and follow with the leash. Okay. So what you're doing is a gradual weaning process off of it. And, to be honest with you, 99% of people want their dog to come when called. If for no other command that they would do would be coming when called. So working on that heel command to begin with is actually it's a short version of come back to me, yeah. Right? Then we would go to the check cord, a long cord. For people who don't understand that, it'd be 30 feet or 50. And then we could give a tug on the cord with your come command, or we use here, and then add the correction in with it. And don't be quick to get off the cord, because really your dog is trying to figure out how to respond to the remote collar, and your leash or your check cord is always your backup in case the dog doesn't understand. And then you can always add the leash in there, because that's something you should have worked on for several months now. So the dog always has something to relate to, that, okay, yeah, I understand what to do. So I'm not quick to okay, I'm doing the remote collar for 2 days and okay, we're set to go.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point.
That's a big mistake.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of trainers, amateur trainers, probably do that. And I think a lot of that also is that excitement is once they get some of those basic commands down, they get excited to send that dog on a retrieve and watch it go without the leash or the check cord, I guess I should say. And I'm sure that's just the excitement of the hunter, of the dog and the trainer together, kind of, feeding off of each other, I would imagine that probably leads to that mistake. As we move forward, as you get these basics, when you said you stick with the check cord longer, than most people, I guess.
Right. And then you need to also add, as your dog gets good with you with no distractions while you're training, don't have a bunch of things going on. Then start putting some distractions in your training. Another person that's there, and maybe another dog that's not running around with your dog, but somebody has another dog on leash. Those are going to distract your dog from paying attention to you. We put a lot of those in play when we have the leash and the check cord on, because we want them to understand that no matter what's going on, no matter what's happening, you have to be responsive. But we would also have done those things with the leash and check cord without the remote collar. So what we're doing is we're just getting them to the point where they're going to be pretty much foolproof with whatever distractions that you're going to come up with. I mean, that it's really important, because you're going to find that, hey, when we're all by ourselves, everything is really working good. As soon as the distraction comes, you're going to find out, we're really not there yet. So as you get really good with the check cord and the remote collar, or the leash and the remote collar, start putting some distractions in there. You're also going to find probably at that point, you're going to have to go up a level or two or whatever it might be, because you're going to see your dog probably blow off, your command, because the distraction is greater. So that's just your indication, like, okay, I guess that wasn't enough. Let's go up a level. Was that enough? Well, maybe not. Let's go up one more level. And then gradually you can come back down.
Yeah, and when you say distractions, you're also, this is a good time to introduce, and probably have already done so on the check cord earlier, but also tie in decoys. Maybe it's field decoys or, something like that, is a distraction for a dog who's never seen them. I've seen some other trainers who introduce some of these things at a fairly young age, so that the first time they get out in the field, they're not just absolutely surprised. So would you recommend other distractions, other than just dogs or people, or, actual hunting scenario type things at this age, or are you still waiting on that?
Well, that would have been stuff that we would have already done. And that's not really, if I'm introducing decoys, I'm going to have them in the yard and let the dog, young one, just run through them. I'll have him on a leash and just walk through them. And I'm not going to discipline him, at that point in time. He's got to sniff them. He's got to smell them. There's two reactions. They're either going to be aggressive. Hey, I want to pick this up. Or they may be shy of them, going like, whoa, what's this thing? And I definitely, if you had a dog that was unsure of them, I wouldn't want to give them a correction, because you don't want your dog to be fearful to go through decoys. You want your dog to go, oh, okay, it's just something here that I'm gonna do. So all those things would be separated, and they wouldn't involve any kind of corrections right there, or definitely not any remote collar corrections, because the remote collar is so effective that I wouldn't want my dog to be afraid of decoys as well. So let's say if you were trash training, don't chase a car, don't get in the garbage. We would refer to that as trash training. I want the dog to get a correction and then avoid that scenario. But we don't want our dog to avoid decoys. We want our dogs, because they're going to have to swim through them.
Absolutely.
So also, I wouldn't want a young dog, if I'm putting decoys out in the yard to walk through, I wouldn't want to have a check cord on them where it gets hooked on a decoy, and the dog sees it move and is afraid of it. And now he thinks that the decoy is chasing him. Some people have seen, especially a young dog, if they're swimming through decoys where they catch the line, they hook the line, and that decoy is going to swing around behind them, and it's going to start hitting him on the back of the head. Well, geez, they think they're getting chased. So there's a lot of little things on decoy introduction as well that you don't want those problems to happen. When I'm training in the water with the decoys, you're going to be right on the shore's edge, a foot out the water. And then gradually I'll put them out a little further. So everything that you do, and I think this really even goes back to the remote collar training, everything you do needs to be slowly prepped, build confidence and repetition. Because anything you try to do fast can come to end up to bite you. And it's always hard to kind of undo something, especially if the dog has had a bad experience. It's right under the surface, and they're always going to be like conscious of it. So if I'm going to give somebody advice, it's like, take your time. This is not a quick thing. Like I had problems with, I went out hunting this last weekend. The dog wasn't listening. I'm going to go buy a remote collar and I'm going to have him ready for next weekend. It's not going to happen. It's the greatest training tool really that we've ever came across, but it's not a quick fix.
There's probably a long list of mistakes that people make with those, and you've mentioned several already. What are some of the other, common mistakes that you hear? I'll say amateur trainers, people who are trying to train their own dog. What are some of the other common mistakes that people make at this stage in the game? Other than potential collar conditioning and things like that. Is there anything else that pops out to you?
Well, I think the when to use your collar also, as you've done. Let's say you've gone through your collar conditioning. And I talked about, I'm not going to be using the collar in those early stages on any retrieving drills.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want my dog to think that every time he goes to pick something up, he's going to get a correction. Because now you can get him to the stage where he goes, well, every time I go out to pick something up, I get corrected. Now, if you could sit down and explain to him, go, you know what, I just want to do this. So when you have something, you should come back to me. They don't understand that. They understand, what am I doing at the time I'm getting correct? So that's something. And then let's say you have a dog that breaks, you're in the blind and breaks. And now you start overcorrecting your dog, early on for breaking. Well, what do you think the next step is? He says, well, why should I go?
Yeah, he's not going to go. He's going to be scared.
Every time I get a heavy correction. Now, we do correct these dogs gradually as time goes up when we're working with the cord, the check cord, and then, but we're not overstimulating them with the collar to go. Because now you have a dog that goes, well, I'm not going to go. Well, your natural response is, well, I better not ask him to stay anymore. My only thing that I can think of is I just need to just let him go. Well, now you've just fed into the fact that now I have a dog that won't be steady. I just got to let him break. So those preps on steadiness also for a duck dog would be done with the leash, the check cord gradually, and then the remote collar. But once again, and we're not even talking, Chris, about having a dog force fetch to retrieve and all of the commands that could be reinforced. All of our dogs that go through a program, have all their obedience, reinforced with the remote collar. Their force fetching or, trained retrieve conditioning is also, finished off with the remote training collar. So what I'm saying is, if you work hard on one command, it can affect something else that you're doing that you don't see coming down the line. Too much recall where you're just really, here, come, and getting corrected. Well, why won't my dog leave my side now?
Yeah, I've seen that scenario, and this is kind of me just curious. I've been hunting with someone who does have the dog on a collar, and the dog will break, but they don't necessarily. The dog is running out there, and they kind of pause. They wait a little while, and it seems like then the dog doesn't even know what it's being corrected for. Once the dog, it's almost like, I guess I'm asking, this has to be an immediate correction in a situation like that, correct?
Yeah. Think about the hardest thing. You're sitting there duck hunting, especially. You're watching the ducks come in. Your dog is as well. Your attention is on jumping up and shooting.
Mm-hmm.
So where does that leave you with your dog? So by the time you get up, if your dog is anticipating and is thinking about breaking, by the time you shoot, your dog is probably 10 yards out already.
Oh yeah.
So that's a hard thing to do. So, what we'll do with those younger dogs, training is training because we really can control the environment. But with those young dogs on their first hunt or two, I always suggest have your buddy shoot. You be right there with your dog so you can manage if steadiness is important to you, so you can manage it on the spot. So it doesn't, it just doesn't manifest itself. I've seen these dogs get so bad that you can just be sitting in the duck blind and there's no birds coming. If you click the safety, the dog will take off.
Oh, yeah.
They've gotten to the stage where all of those sequences come into place. So, and I'll also tell people, let's just talk about steady, because what does a duck dog have to do? He's got to sit, right? He's got to sit next to you. You knock a duck down, and then go pick it up and come back. So what is it? Sit and stay, go out and come.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really that basic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when people are training, let's just say on a dog being steady, train on steady. Train on having the dog sit and stay there. You're not training the dog on retrieving. So, throw a dummy. Don't send him. Or if you throw a dummy in the backyard, depending on the dog's age now, if you have a dog that has some drive and maybe just a little bit older, make him sit there for 10 minutes. You're working on steadiness. You're not working on retrieving. Now, if I have a puppy, obviously, you're not going to ask him to sit there for 10 minutes. And I'll even be out hunting. And if I've got, a seasoned dog and, let's say I'm hunting over water, if I'm hunting land and we knock some birds down, and especially if it's water and I know that it's not going to drift away on me, it might float out there for 15 minutes and then I'll send them. So what they're learning through your training, and they're only going to learn by what you're doing in the backyard, is that retrieving is based on, if I see something fall, it's not going to be 1001, 1002, and then my owner's going to send me. So if you're working on something, work on that task. You're not working on retrieving there. If you're working on steadiness, work on steady, and then if you're working on retrieving, work on retrieve. Same way with all of this collar conditioning stuff. And think about if you're working on all your commands. I want my dog to sit and stay with the remote collar. I want my dog to lay down with the remote collar. I want to do these things. Well, if you're gradually using the remote collar 99% of the time for coming when called, right, for recall, now you tell the dog you want him to sit and stay, and he's maybe not responding, and you give a collar correction. He's probably going to come running to you. And you go, wait, what? No, I told you to sit and stay. Well, what have you been doing 99% of the time? You've been working on recall. So when you get to the stage where we're reinforcing all the commands, whether it's with the leash or the remote collar, balance it. Spend time on each individual command. And then when you're doing maintenance training on a dog, like these older dogs, spend equal amount of time on every command that you're going to be working on. Because if you overdo one command, that's going to be your dog's major response.
Yeah, that definitely leads into kind of the next segment of this where, these older dogs who are experienced, have you seen in your experience, have you seen these older dogs have a tendency to be more collar conditioned just because they've used them for 6-7 years, and they maybe have created their own idea of what this is. Have you seen some of that with the older dogs? And if so, how do you go about breaking that?
I think the older dogs, for them, if it's been done right and they've had the collar conditioning, tuning them up is not as big as adventure as it was 25, 30 years ago. I mean, you can hunt a dog several times, maybe 4 or 5 times, and all of a sudden, little things start coming up, little problems start coming up. And it would always take us longer to get that dog back into the habit. Nowadays, these dogs that have had a full collar conditioning, you can put them back into some basic drills and maybe get a correction where they've disobeyed, and they'll come back around really quick. And most of the time with these older dogs, it's first time out during the season. In a lot of cases, is you watch for your steadiness. I mean, because they're excited, they want to go, they want to make the retrieve. So right out of the chute, are they going to be steady? Be ready for that correction. It's normally not on these older dogs. Will they come to me? Will they come back? That's not it. It's are they going to be steady? So watch for that immediately. A little drill that you can do with an older dog, and you'll catch them making this mistake, is when nothing's going on, jump up like you're going to shoot, because you're going to see are they anticipating breaking, but then be ready to get a correction in. Or you can even jump up and shoot when nothing's going on, and you're going to catch them breaking and make a correction. So you can get them to the point when you jump up quickly, they understand that that means sit here and stay. Most people are in the backyard, they're standing up and they throw a dummy, right? They throw a dummy, or they go to the water, they're standing and throwing a dummy. How many times are you sitting down and jumping up to throw a dummy?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right? I mean, it's the sequence, isn't it?
Yeah, jump up, part of the process.
Jump up quick and shoot. Jump up quick and shoot. Well, they see that, and they're going to get in the habit of, that's when I'm going to break. So you have to set these things up. And pretty soon with these older dogs, they go, I smell a setup. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? They go, no, I'm not falling for that one. But you want to set that sequence up.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to do in training prior to the season, is set up those sequences so the dog starts sensing what you're really after.
Now, one question that, I've been asked via email, not necessarily a listener, but someone from social media, using the e-collar in avoidance training. So if they're, let's say, I know a lot of people, I know in Minnesota, you probably don't have this problem near as much, but down here in the South, especially training in early spring and parts of the summer, there's a lot of snakes. And is that something where you would use the e-collar in that process as well as an avoid? And it could be anything that you want. That you mentioned, like the trash can. That's what it reminded me of that email. Is that something that you would use that, and how do you go about that process?
Yeah, and that's important because you get in the western states or the southern states, snakes are a big thing. So it's the same thing. You might call it avoidance. It's just I just say it's a variation of trash breaking. Mm-hmm. Trash breaking means don't do that. Don't go after that. I know, we hunt in Arizona, we hunt quail out in Arizona, and, it's important to have those dogs all conditioned. And with the remote collar there, now it's a little different. They're not going to start off on a light setting on something like that. They want to make a huge statement when they make a correction on snake avoidance. So they're going to run that collar up there pretty high, because that dog shows any indication. I mean, they want a severe correction. And so that would vary a little bit. And that would be the same thing. Let's say you had a dog that, when you're trash breaking now, okay, a dog that is going to chase a car. Well, you're saving their life basically by doing this type of training. You'd make a heavy correction. Now, preferably I'd want my dog to be collar conditioned on all of its commands, because we're not going to go to the highest level, on the majority of all dogs. On something like this, then you want a higher setting. Hound trainers have been at this forever, chasing deer, chasing unwanted game. They weren't doing a lot of obedience training with their hounds. They just didn't want them chasing certain things, and they would set them up with a pretty high correction. So, but it's important, to do that. But if that's your dog's first correction with a collar is trash, and you're setting it really high, I want to tell you then, if you went back and then you started your basic obedience training, and even if you started on a light level, your dog is going to react a lot of cases on those light levels like it is a super high level, because their first experience was super high, right? So now you might be going on a light level and your dog is overreacting, which you don't want your dog overreacting where they're panicked about any kind of commands. You want those light levels to begin with, and then work it up. Now, if you worked it to a certain level and now you go and trash break, I think it's different. I just do. I think it's different. We haven't even talked about like in-ground fencing, for your yard and stuff. A lot of those things, those conditioning processes are the same. Not started on super high level, and then they gradually work up. Your dog will, find a level where, their correction is going to be right for them. So I think as we talk about all of this, if you're doing obedience training or you're getting your sporting dog, conditioned for working in the field, but working happy, working with high drive, but under control, you start light level and work your way up. If you went to trash breaking, you just go up higher.
Yeah, and I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head throughout this whole thing with the process, encouraging people, one, to take it slow, but also the full process of conditioning and obedience training. All of that needs to be in place. And then the introduction to the collar. There's no real reason to rush this. And I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. And I think that's a great takeaway for our audience who are out there either curious about getting into training or in the process of. There's some people. We have people here at Ducks Unlimited who have their dogs out at lunch and they're running drills and things like that. So it's all a really good lesson in patience. And I think that, and for me, I always say I'm a pretty mediocre dog trainer, but as a true amateur dog trainer, I think that's one thing to really keep in mind. So that's great. My last question for you, Tom, we'll get you out of here. Can you think of one example, and this just kind of popped in my head, can you think of one example where the introduction of the e-collar was just an absolute savior, where someone maybe brought you a dog, was like, hey, we're having problems with this, and you introduced that collar. Is there one example of that really sticks out in your mind?
Well, I think, it might even be broader than that, because the majority of the dogs we train nowadays are family dogs. Mm-hmm. So they live in the house. So this isn't dad's dog that lives in the backyard and mom has no contact or could care less about, what's going on. I mean, so what's really a big thing is when we get this hunting dog fully trained, we bring mom in as well, because because we want her to know how to understand how to have that dog behaving and responding to her. And what happens there is now this family pet gets a tremendous amount of freedom because mom has control of this dog as well and has the response. She doesn't have to be able to bench press 500 pounds to control the dog anymore. The remote collar took care of all of that. So let's say a number 3 level, for me, if I'm training, if I hand that dog over to my wife, she's not a dog trainer. If I hand it over and go, the dog's on a number 3, one correction and the dog goes, yep, you're the boss. Now think about all of the places that these dogs will go with the family because they have a well-behaved dog. So that gratification, from those owners going, you know what? It's like we have a brand new dog. A part of the hunting end of it, we have a brand new dog. But we enjoy it so much more now because the dog's happy but is responsive. And I think when we start talking, remote collars, it's not how often you use it. It's the fact that these dogs end up being such good citizens because they control whether they get corrected or not. And they're happy about that. They know their place. And then more importantly, the owners are happy as well.
No, that's awesome. That's a really good point, Tom. I appreciate you bringing that up. And I don't really even know anyone that I hunt with that has a dog, like you mentioned, that's like an outside dog that their wife doesn't deal with them. That family aspect of the retriever is so crucial to be a part of the training process. I think that's one thing. Another thing for everyone to remember.
Right. Yeah. And that's changed. I would say 30 plus years ago, the scenario was it was dad's dog. Now, this is a family dog / hunting dog. We're the same way. Our dogs are in the house with us. On the same hand, they're watching you to see how consistent you're going to be as well. Are you going to be consistent on making me respond and be behaved, or are you going to slack off? So they're kind of a true reflection of how consistent we are too.
Yeah, I don't know one dog that is not willing to take the risk to try and test the boundaries just to see. I've been around some very good.
We did it as kids, didn't we?
Oh yeah. No, I've been around some very well-mannered dogs, but even the best are willing to maybe test it on occasion, just to try it. Well, Tom, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you coming on, talking about SportDOG products. It's been great. I hope that our audience was able to take away, this long list of good training tips that you've brought to the forefront and the products. It's been a great conversation. We'll have to get you back on again.
You bet. And Chris, just a follow up is that, people can go to that SportDOG website and see the videos of the things that we talked about today too. So, I'd encourage them to go to there as well.
Absolutely. People can visit SportDOG.com. Check out all those videos, walk through some of the actual processes that Tom was describing in this podcast. It's a great resource. Thanks again, Tom. I really appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
I'd like to thank my guest, Tom Dokken, for joining us today and talking about SportDOG products and introducing e-collars and everything you could possibly imagine about e-collars. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us in supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.